Well, I'd like to officially welcome you at this point. My name is Laura Brandis, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the Communications Director here at the POLIS Water Sustainability Project, which is based at the University of Victoria's Centre for Global Studies. I want to welcome all of you today to this webinar, which is the second webinar in this year's Creating a Blue Dialogue series. We've been running this series for 5 years now, and one of the main goals is for us to bring together in one virtual space water leaders and professionals from a diversity of backgrounds from all across the country to discuss innovative and emerging topics in water policy and governance. As you know, today's session is about Aboriginal co-governance of water and watersheds, and today's presentations will actually be building on our September webinar, which focused on 9 winning conditions for moving towards watershed governance in British Columbia. And Aboriginal co-governance was one of the winning conditions that was briefly discussed back in September. If any of you haven't seen that webinar or weren't able to attend, we did record it, so just send me an email, or actually at the end of this session I'll just provide a link where you can go and check out that previous session. And as some of you already know, I mentioned earlier, we had record-breaking registration for this session, so much so that earlier this week I was on the phone with our webinar provider trying to figure out how we could possibly increase the attendance limit at our webinars to get all of you in the room today. So I know many of you were on the waiting list and got an email earlier in the week from Megan. We're really pleased that we were able to get this temporary burst in attendance because it will be a really robust discussion, I think. And as I already mentioned too, given the diverse expertise in the room today, our team here at the Water Project is hoping to use today's session as a bit of a research opportunity. That's what some of that initial fun word cloud polling was about. And also, if any of you in the room have any resources on the topic of co-governance or know of any really good on-the-ground examples, either successful or unsuccessful, please contact us, because we are starting to sort of delve into this topic in a little bit more depth. So of course, we couldn't carry out this series with the support of our many partners and supporters. All of them are listed on this slide, and in particular I want to draw your attention to the Canadian Water Network for being our core supporter of this year's series, and also to Water Canada magazine, who is our media supporter. So as per usual, a few housekeeping things before we begin. The first has to do with audio. As you probably all realized, I have a blanket mute on everybody in the room except for me and the presenters. The reason for this is we're expecting about 160 connections on the line, so it would be utter chaos if I let you all run free and wild, but that's what the chat box is for. So that brings me to point 2. For the question period, I know, Travis, I know, what can I do? The question period, we do want to hear all of your voices, so we'll handle that via the chat box. You can type your questions in there. I'll serve as the moderator. I'll read them out. And the 3 speakers will be on the line as our panelists, and we'll handle the questions that way. I know a lot of you are already introducing yourself. That's my third point. If you haven't yet, I would invite you to please let us know who you are, what organization you're with, how many people are in the room with you. I know a few of you have signed out boardrooms. It's difficult with this platform sometimes to get a sense of community, and I really try to build that as much as possible with these webinars. So that brings me to today's speakers. The first person you're going to hear from today is Nadia Joe, and she is the Water Project Manager at the First Nations Fishery Council. And as Nadia describes, that I'm going to read from her bio here, from starting a snowmobile with her shoelaces to standing her ground when charged by a frothing grizzly protecting 2 cubs, Nadia can be a very useful person to have around when resources are thin. She is a member of the Crow clan from the Champagne and Ashihik, Nadia, please correct me if I'm wrong there, First Nations, and she spent much of her childhood on the land with her grandparents, where she knew the privilege of drinking water straight from the streams and crisscrossing her traditional territory in southwestern Yukon. Nadia completed a fellowship with the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, And because clean and abundant water is so significant to her community, she applied this fellowship to advancing her community's vision of shared water governance and management. Nadia holds a BSc in chemistry, an MSc in environmental management, and she recently returned from a year in both Italy and Australia, where she was doing applied research on new technologies for treating water and wastewater. And now that she's back on home and native land, as she puts it, she's really excited to be part of the water project team at the First Nations Fisheries Council. Our second speaker today is going to be Eli Enns, who is a Nuu-chah-nulth Canadian political scientist. He's also co-founder of the Housekeeping Tribal Park in Clayoquot Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which Eli will tell you more about later this morning. Eli's great-grandfather, Nawasum, was a public speaker and historian for Wickaninnish Taihawi of Tlaoquiet. Eli is a proud father of 5, and as such, he holds himself accountable to future generations, and he gets involved in a number of activities related to this, including as the North American Regional Coordinator for the Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Territories and Areas Consortium, and he's also an affiliate here at the POLIS project. And Eli has also developed an Indigenous watershed management area program, which aims to complement an ecological governance approach with a well-thought-out ecological economics component. And finally, Merrell-Ann Phare is here with us. She's going to be here as a bit of a discussant after both Nadia and Eli's presentations. And Merrell-Ann is a lawyer and the founding executive director of the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. She's the author of the book Denying the Source, The Crisis of First Nations Water Rights, and co-author of the book Ethical Water. Merrell-Ann is also a member of the Forum for Leadership on Water, also known as FLOW, and the Water Partners Advisory Committee for the Council of the Federation. She is chief negotiator on behalf of the Northwest Territories in their negotiation of transboundary water agreements in the Mackenzie River Basin. And Merrell-Ann is also legal counsel and advisor to a number of First Nation and other governments and organizations regarding water matters. So I hope you all listened very attentively to that because it's going to come in handy. At this point, Nadia, will you please press *6 to unmute your line? I'm going to hand the reins over to you and you can dive into your presentation. Hi, Nadia. Are you there? I just unmuted you.
Okay. Oh, hi. Perfect, Laura. Sorry, I just wanted to, well, first of all, thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks to everyone participating in this event. I just got a bit of housekeeping to take care of first. I'm having some connectivity issues. And so, Laura, if you're able to, if I'm not able to advance my slides, I can just...
Oh. We lost your audio, Nadia. I'm more than happy to advance your slides. I'm not sure if you can hear me right now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I've got you loud and clear. So maybe what I'll do is I'll let you advance my slides and I'll follow with my own PowerPoint presentation at home, and then that way we don't have to worry about reconnecting if I drop out.
Yeah, sure. Do you just want to say slide or something equally as obvious for my cue?
Perfect. That
okay.
Works great.
Great.
Okay. So again, thank you for the introduction. Thanks to everyone here on this event. I admit I've been listening in on these webinars for a few years now, and I was actually listening in on the one that you had held back in September. And when I heard the announcement for this particular upcoming webinar on co-governance of water and watersheds with First Nations, I remember thinking to myself that this was definitely something that I wanted to participate in. And so when I was hired at the First Nations Fisheries Council just a week later, I really didn't expect that I would be the one actually delivering this presentation. So I can only hope that my presentation kind of meets my own expectations that I'd had for this webinar a few months back. So next slide. Okay. Looking at what is co-governance, well, like anything, co-governance can mean different things to different people, but just so we're all working off of the same assumptions, for my presentation today, co-governance in its simplest terms is simply shared decision-making. And next slide. this breaks down into who is making the decision and how the decisions are made. So in terms of co-governance, you've got two parties with some degree of authority coming together and agreeing to work through some sort of process that is reasonably structured, preferably transparent, and has some degree of accountability that in the end results in a decision, hopefully the right decision, but that can be another discussion. The next slide. So when I was developing this presentation, I wanted to emphasize this notion of rediscovery because there's nothing really new about this concept of shared decision-making or co-governance, just the scale at which it's being proposed. So participatory approaches to the management of local lands and resources has been an established practice by Aboriginal people since long before contact. And for anyone who's been a part of a team, you intuitively understand the value of sharing knowledge, sharing responsibilities, and sharing resources. So Aboriginal peoples not only simply occupied the lands in Canada prior to contact, but we also had very structured practices and protocols that informed our relationships with each other and that also governed our relationships with the lands, the waters, and the resources. So next slide. So as Laura mentioned, I am a member of the Crow clan from the Champagne and Ajax First Nation in southwestern Yukon.
Nadia, I'm just going to interrupt. A couple people are saying it's a little bit hard to hear you. I'm going to turn up the volume a bit, but I don't know if you're able to talk a little bit closer into your phone or something like that, we can give it a try. I can hear you fine. I think it's just a few people, so just a heads up since you can't see the chat box.
Okay, great. No, that's great feedback. So I'll hold my phone up while I'm talking. Hopefully that's a little bit better. So as I mentioned, I'm a member of the Crow clan from the Champagne and Ajax First Nation in southwestern Yukon. And the social organization of my community revolves around this clan-based political system which follows a matrilineal succession. Of course, right? So I belong to the same clan as my mother, essentially. And traditionally, each of these two clans, the wolf on the bottom and the crow on the top, assumed very specific responsibilities that would dictate not only our individual responsibilities, such as whom I could and couldn't marry, but a much broader responsibility as well as a member of my clan. So this could mean that certain areas and certain resources within those areas may either be my responsibility to care for, or I may in fact be prohibited from using them without some express consent from someone in the wolf clan who's responsible for that area or that resource. So next slide. So it's these traditional practices and protocols, as well as our relationships to the lands and the waters, that actually form the basis of what Aboriginal rights comprise. So Aboriginal rights are just rights that are integral to each of our distinctive cultures. And it's important to note here at the bottom that these rights are not frozen in time, but in fact evolve in a manner that's consistent with the original practice or tradition. Next slide. And these rights are in fact embedded in Canada's highest law, which is the law that governs all of us as Canadians. And this is the Constitution of Canada. Next slide. So combined, Aboriginal rights and the constitutional protection of these rights within the existing legal framework inform the Crown's responsibility to consult Aboriginal peoples and, where appropriate, accommodate or perhaps even achieve consent when the Crown has knowledge of the potential existence of Aboriginal rights or treaty rights and is contemplating something that might adversely affect these rights. So, next slide. I think it's easy to see how deteriorating or degraded quality of water can adversely impact both potential and established Aboriginal rights or treaty rights. So poor water quality, degraded aquatic habitats, or even reduced access to our waters not only affects our ability as Aboriginal peoples to fish, to feed ourselves and our communities, but it can also change our relationships and how we're able to relate to our lands and our waters by effectively limiting our ability to practice our ceremonies and to show reverence to the sacred, by changing our stories and even the nature of our connection to our history and identity as Aboriginal people, and of course by limiting our ability to harvest country foods and traditional medicines. So given the potential that these conditions pose to Aboriginal rights, what are the opportunities for First Nations to begin to influence how our waters are cared for such that consideration is given also to cultural water values in addition to the water values that have already been identified and protected for. So next slide. So based on a number of court rulings, naming, say, for instance, Tilcoteen, Housets, Barrow, Vanderpeach, Haida, Taku River, Get, Calder, et cetera, there's certainly arguments that can be made, legal arguments that can be made to help support First Nations advance co-governance and co-management of water. So there's this legal test to determine if an Aboriginal right exists, often referred to as the Vanderpeach test. So for instance, First Nations, in terms of establishing some sort of right to water, First Nations would first need to demonstrate that First Nations use of water predates contact. Okay, yeah, I think we can do that. Another part of this test is looking at cultural water use, is showing that it's integral and of central significance to our practices, our customs and traditions, and check there as well. And also that First Nations continue to use water in a manner that's consistent with past practices, customs, and traditions. So yeah, I think this is covered. So clearly I have zero legal training, but I think it's difficult not to see how cultural water uses might actually be considered Aboriginal rights, if not now, then in the future. So next slide. So an additional tool that may help advance a co-governance model with First Nations, particularly here in BC, is the relatively new Water Sustainability Act. So this act addresses a number of issues that, in principle, are of course all important to First Nations communities in BC and offer significant potential for First Nations to engage in the discussion of water governance and management in the province. And in particular, looking at this bottom one here, that this provision for a range of governance approaches that could include the establishment of decentralized governance boards or governance structures. So the legal and the legislative tools that are now available to us indicate that we as a province are well positioned to improve how water is governed and managed in BC through a shared governance and shared management model. So let's begin to imagine what that might look like. Next slide, please. So would there be one activity here that might be overrepresented in this picture, or could there be room to somehow equitably balance all of our water needs and our water uses in the province, such that all interests are given balanced consideration and that conditions that are restricting various water uses can and will be enforced? So then how do we achieve this? Next slide. Well, we've already established that there's this strong legal framework, say the court rulings in particular, for advancing shared governance and shared management with Aboriginal peoples in BC. But I think there's this uncomfortable truth that we need to first acknowledge before we can really progress much further towards advancing this new model. And that's simply recognizing that there's this growing divide between the direction that the courts seem to be pointing us towards and the direction that the government and perhaps other stakeholders in Canadian society are moving towards. So there's this elephant in the room that we can no longer afford to overlook, the additional relationships that are actually necessary in making co-governance an effective arrangement. So what do I mean by this? Well, when I was a kid, next slide please. When I was a kid growing up, I admit I was a pesky kid sister. I had this older brother who was 5 years older, and there was nothing more exciting to me than tagging along with him and his friends, and he hated it. His friends hated it. I didn't belong. I could never keep up. I was always asking them to slow down. And when they wouldn't, I usually ended up hurting myself very badly in some cases, and sometimes they'd have to carry me home when they would then get a scolding from my mother. But as we've matured, we get along fine now. But what I've since discovered is that I've outgrown this pesky kid sister, and I've grown into an even more uncomfortable role. And so while I'm no longer the pesky kid sister, I've become this pesky Indian, to use a term from Thomas King's book, The Inconvenient Indian. So I finally have an invitation to sit at the table, but it doesn't seem to matter which table I'm at right now, because as a pesky Indian, nobody really wants me there. I definitely don't belong. I'm often accused of being entitled, and that's when I kind of scratch my head and think, entitled to my own lands and resources? really? Well, whose else are they? And I'm always in the position of sounding like a broken record when I continually have to remind, that other nation, the government, that, wait, I think you might have forgotten to honor your commitments and uphold the Constitution here. And because of this, I for sure hold up the group's discussions, and I'm often accused of being either an encumbrance or hindering progress. But when I look around at the speed and the pace of industrial development in our traditional territories, or the legislation that's so quickly passed that can actually undermine the nation-to-nation relationship that my nation and many other First Nations have with Canada, and I compare these conditions experienced by the majority of Aboriginal peoples in Canada, including my own family, I can't help but wonder about whose progress is actually being hindered here. So next slide, please. A necessary building block to actually progressing a model of shared governance has to include reconciliation. And while we may have the legal framework to begin structuring a co-governance model for water, we can't overlook the nature of the relationship between the Canadian Crown, the provincial crowns, and First Nations, nor can we afford to overlook the relationships between Aboriginal peoples and Canadians. So, next slide. We're joined today by a number of First Nations from across the province and across the country. So just to name a few, there's Namgis, Nikomin, Stalo, Halalt, Gitsagukla, just to name a few of the nations and communities that comprise more than 200 First Nations communities here in BC. And so I invite those of you on the call today to use the little chat box and share your relationship with your First Nations neighbors. For instance, how would you characterize the nature of your relationships with your neighbors? Does everyone know who their First Nations neighbors are? Do you know how to pronounce their names? And maybe you have successful working relationships, and if you can maybe describe how that came about. Next slide, please. Well, maybe not everyone has a relationship with their First Nations neighbors, and that's fine. But if you're interested in where to begin, and considering the topic of this webinar and the appetite for this webinar, I imagine a lot of people on this call are, well, building relationships with First Nations doesn't have to be all that different than building a relationship with anyone else. You find some common ground to build a bridge over, and you add some fundamental stepping stones. And maybe this seems like a lot of work. Maybe some of you are feeling frustrated with how slowly things are progressing and how long it actually takes to develop a relationship that's stable enough to endure the conflict, which is probably going to be inevitable when you begin to share decision-making, particularly over water. But then, given the constitutional basis that recognizes Aboriginal rights and title to land and the resources in that land, then what are the alternatives to a co-governance approach? Next slide, please. Well, looking back, we've already tried these approaches. We've tried assimilation. We've done dislocation and even extermination of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And in addition to the high costs, I'm hoping that most, if not all of you on the call, will raise some serious moral objections to these tactics. Next slide, please. And court ruling after court ruling have also shown us that these two approaches, maintaining the status quo or simply ignoring it, that these are no longer viable alternatives to shared management or shared governance either. Next slide, please. So maybe instead of looking at this process of relationship building with First Nations as just another exercise to achieve co-governance, instead I think we need to start looking at establishing co-governance with Aboriginal peoples as an exercise in nation building. And that is a nation that is mature enough to acknowledge its past while embracing its future. Next slide. So let's begin. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nadia. So Eli, you're up next. If you want to press *6 on your telephone, that will bring your voice on the line. Oh, and Eli is asking if there is a hashtag for the webinar. I don't have a formalized one. I don't know if somebody out there has already started one. Maybe someone in the chat box could let us know. If not, I'd say something like #POLIS webinar. Eli, I've just unmuted you. Oops. Okay, are you there, Eli?
Can you hear me, Laura?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Okay, good stuff. All right, so I guess I should just launch into this presentation.
Yes.
All right, so thank you, Nadia, for that very thoughtful presentation. That was excellent. So I'm going to be speaking today about examples of Indigenous watershed governance. And I kind of cheekily named my slide Watershed Governance in Kanata. And so for those of you who are not aware, the word Canada comes from an Iroquois word, Kanata, which means village. And I think this rediscovery that we're on right now, particularly in BC, but everywhere across Canada, is truly a rediscovery of our true nature as a country and what Canada is, which is, it is an international social innovation. So I'm not going to beleaguer the history too much, but I do want to provide these two images which provide a little bit of a visual context for the geopolitical developments in Kanata. The photograph or the map art from the Canada Archives shows what this country looked like a few years after the British North American Act and the confederation of the country. And as you can see, it looks a lot different than the maps we're used to looking at today. And this is a really good, picture says 1,000 words type scenario. And if you notice, all of the Western provinces are not delineated as they are today, back in 1871. That didn't come along until the Land Transfer Agreement of 1931. This is all constitutional law. British Columbia was delineated exactly as it is today, back when it joined Confederation in 1871. And there's reasons behind that, and these are part and parcel to why there's still an outstanding so-called modern-day treaty process here in British Columbia. So, and just to explain that a little bit, if you look at the drawing of what I call the family of Canada, the early relationship building between King George and the Indigenous nations of North America were commemorated in items such as the wampum belts. So if you can see between King George and the Indigenous nations, at the time, God or the Creator or the Great Spirit was a very real presence in the dialogue amongst the various nations. Fresh out of the 7 Years' War, the Iroquois Confederacy and King George made a solemn promise, a solemn oath to one another, which was commemorated in the wampum belt. And this is very important, it's very relevant today, because that promise included the the nation-to-nation relationship, one of brotherhood and sisterhood, a relationship of respect, and living respectfully on the land. And so the very constitutional foundation of this country is premised on the international agreement to live respectfully on the land. And so this relationship developed over many years. It began with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and the most recent iteration is the Supreme Court decision, June 26th, of the Chief Roger Williams court case on Aboriginal title. So this image here just gives you a little bit of context. Important distinction, if you look down below the federal government, which was created by Section 91 of the British North American Act. You can see the Indian Act bans that were created by various groups, Department of Indian Affairs, Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. That's where the Indian Act identity is, but up higher, on par with King George and under the blessing of the Great Spirit, we have this relationship here where Indigenous nations have Section 35 rights in the Constitution. Okay, so getting right into some examples, some recent developments, and there's so many. It's just coming from every corner of Canada. There's so many going on in British Columbia. I'm going to focus in on a few here that I know best. So the 1984 Mears Island Tribal Park Declaration. That declaration and the subsequent court injunction, or interlocutory court injunction, has protected the ancient cedar rainforests of Mears Island for 30 years. We just celebrated the 30-year anniversary of the Mears Island Tribal Park, and if you look at the photograph on the bottom, that is the House of Iwas in Tlaoquiit Indigenous Confederation. Moses Martin is standing there with his daughter. He was on the blockades, the front lines of the blockades in the Mears Island Tribal Park Declaration. And this is a photograph of the 30-year celebration of that event. Very important to watershed governance. The Mears Island Tribal Park Declaration specifically identifies the provision of clean drinking water not only to Opitsat, which is our Tlaoquiit community, but also to the municipality of Tofino. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened after 1984. The Haida victory on the duty to consult in 2004 is notable because it was the first, well, it was a clear indication from the courts that status quo, business as usual, is no longer acceptable. So it's kind of a backwards process that happened. The court said you have to negotiate treaties in the future because of this historical reality of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And then BC and Canada said, okay, we'll negotiate for the future, but they continued to wholesale resources. The Haida victory said, no, you can no longer wholesale resources while you're negotiating. So we start moving backwards, and different nations are starting to bring up compensation as well, and we've heard some thoughtful commentary on that in the media recently. 2007, the Housekeeping Tribal Park establishment. 2014, Tranquil and Essaouista Tribal Park declarations. The Mayor and Council of Victoria passed a resolution in support of the Tranquil Creek Tribal Park. The business community of Tofino was 100% behind Tlaoquiit in that declaration because it was in the face of a Imperial Metals mining proposal. So this is a beautiful example of municipalities and First Nations working together for co-creating their own vision of watershed governance, regardless of the ministerial dabblings with industry. The Bahas Tribal Grounds ICCA declaration happened in 2014 out on their land. June 26th, of course, I had mentioned the Supreme Court of Canada was a strong boost. Important to note that my good friend Danica Littlechild pointed this out to me. She said, yes, this is a great court decision, but we have to bear in mind that this is one government's court decision over our people. Regarding our people, we also have our own law systems, and we have our own moral ethics, and we have our own governance that we have to enliven and bring into its proper role in the Canadian dialogue as Kanata. October 4th, 2014, building on the successful court case, the Hunigwitine and Unisitine nations of Tsilhqot'in, Chief Roger Williams and Russ Ross made the Desico Tribal Park Declaration. This was a beautiful culmination. The entire year, I think 2014 is really going to go down in history for a lot of reasons, but every 10 years, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature holds a big party. They call it the World Parks Congress. It looks at the past 10 years and makes a promise for the next 10 years of conservation globally. In this World Parks Congress was just concluded in Australia. Tribal parks was being voiced through the governance stream, Stream 6, the Indigenous stream, Stream 7, and the cross-cutting themes of the new social compact. So tribal parks was everywhere, and it was the first time. I mean, the last one was in Durban, South Africa, and Nelson Mandela called on the international community to have some equity in this conservation. And so this was the first time we had such a strong presence of Indigenous conservation initiatives. And the ICCA Consortium was a big part of organizing that. What are tribal parks and why? I think this PowerPoint presentation will be probably emailed around or whatever. It's a traditional governance exercise. The language, the culture, the traditions, these are all the heart and soul of the Tribal Parks initiatives. And for us in New Channel, this is a photograph of my brother, Uncle Joe Martin. For us, those rules and regulations from our ancestors are encoded in the art and the totems, and we still have that knowledge, and it still drives our tribal parks and other initiatives that we have. Of course, Section 35. I want to just mention briefly the adherence measures to the 2001 UN Convention on the Responsibility to Protect. And I know that this little agreement is often misused, and there's a lot of dark sides to it, but I think the nature of it is good. You know, human security should be protected everywhere, and a prerequisite of adequate protection and promotion of human security is environmental security. The absence of persistent pollutants and other problems that create chronic health issues in domestic populations. In practice, Indigenous tribal parks are Indigenous watershed governance areas with social, environmental, and economic objectives. Stakeholder management approaches. Building positive peace is a critical aspect of tribal parks initiatives, empowering local communities and bringing them up with the constitutionally protected rights and responsibilities. And of course, monitoring regimes to get the nation and the people out on the ground and monitoring activities. We've got bear poaching and illegal marijuana grow-ops in our territory, and we've had discussions with the RCMP with working together to cut down on those types of activities. The ICCA Consortium, as I had mentioned earlier, is a global phenomenon. It's a global movement of Indigenous-led and community-led conservation initiatives. It was called for in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and that call was answered with the creation of the ICCA Consortium. It's like tribal parks from every corner of the planet. but they all have their own terminology. It's fascinating for me still to see all the different Indigenous communities, and the common things that I hear: people want dignity, to have that relationship of respect, and they want to exercise their ideas for self-determination, which isn't a color-coded scenario or a religious thing. It is a human thing. The desire for self-determination and dignity is a human thing, along with clean water and air. And so, can tribal parks be recognized as ICCAs? Yes, they can, and they are. This is a photograph from a gathering of nations from Ontario and British Columbia we had last November in Tofino, and we're building strong on that early dialogue. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Eli. At this point, I'm going to ask Merrell-Ann if you want to press *6 on your phone. That'll bring your voice on. Actually, oh.
There, do you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Perfect. So you can just take it away, and I see a few of you are starting to type some questions and things in the chat box. It's easiest for me to ensure we don't miss any if you can hold off on those until the end of Merrell-Ann's presentation, and then we'll get into the discussion portion. So take it away, Merrell-Ann.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just speak very briefly about some questions that came to my mind as I was considering this issue, but also listening to the very awesome and stimulating presentations you just heard from Nadia and Eli, where they focused on a wide range of things, from just the idea of governance being actual shared decisions, and that this is an exercise in nation building, and that it's about rediscovering our true nature as a nation. I found those really exciting high-level concepts that are really I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on those. So let me see if my slides, does it work? Yeah, there, okay. So the first slide, I have basically only 3 slides with some questions. I think that a lot remains unspoken when it comes to what we're actually doing when we collaborate to make a decision. In many cases, I think what's going on is half the table is thinking that it's about an elevated form of advice, even a really super elevated form of advice, whereas the other half of the table, usually the silent half, is thinking that it's about actually sharing the decision, or actually it's the other way around. It's the advisory type who kind of keep quiet, and then the other ones are saying, but we're here to share this, are we not? And either way, though, I think most people around the table are trying, they do have the same end goal, which is to try to get to a point where we're happy with the decision. We can see the decision being something that fits in our lives and that we can implement. And so this is the focus of my first question about whether we're really getting at that in the processes we're involved in. Does co-governance mean reaching consensus, or does it mean reaching unanimity? I think it's usually framed that way, and I framed it that way on purpose just to highlight that it's usually given as a black or white choice, that way that reinforces, in my view, the current distribution of power. And it's really hard to find your way through a discussion where the idea of somebody having ultimate authority over someone else is hovering around, another one of Nadia's elephants in the room. To get into a little bit of it, if the process requires unanimity, you can see that it means everybody around the table has to have 100% agreement, and that in the essence, everybody has a veto. All it takes is one person in a unanimous process to say no, and nothing will happen. We're used to that frequently in the involvement of the federal or provincial governments because of the view that they have the ultimate legislative authority. They're seen as having that final decision-making at the end of the day, and they can kind of swoop in at the end of the day if a lot of these management processes aren't working. And in their defense, you can see that if they're actually seen within their system as sharing decision-making, They can receive warnings, and I've heard them myself, from very dire warnings from their justice or policy folks suggesting that, they're fettering authority, they're fettering the minister's authority or their government's legislative authority, and probably a number of you on the call have heard that before if you've tried to create these processes within your systems. The alternate, of course, is to think in terms of consensus, where differing views can stand, but the idea is to achieve consensus on all sides to a level that you're acceptable with. And a good example I'd like to give you is just the recent process of developing the Wildlife Act in the Northwest Territories, where all of the Indigenous governments, whether they had a land claim or not, sat around the table in multiple rounds of negotiations with the GNWT, and everybody had their lawyers to draft, co-draft, everybody's hands on the pen, the new Wildlife Act. And that's not an uncontroversial act. It was in CBC even this morning. But the idea is that everybody was involved on both sides in a piece of legislation that was technically the responsibility only of one of the governments, but it was a collaborative decision what that responsibility would be. And you could see that could flow the other way around too. You could have discussions where you're collaborating on defining the scope of the decisions for all players around the table. As I understand it, NWT is considering doing that same thing as they redefine and rescope their Water Act, which is coming up probably in the next Legislative Assembly. So just thinking that through a little bit too, you can see that that approach is in line with the law on Aboriginal rights, which really what it's saying is create consent through negotiation. It's only in the failure of achieving consent do you engage in Section 35 consultation and, where appropriate, accommodation. I'd like to try to turn that on its head, this idea of what Section 35 is about. The Supreme Court has been so clear, and most clearly in Chilcotin, saying we need to work together and collaborate or negotiate towards consent. That's the actual duty of all players around the table. And so in these collaborative governance processes, you can think of them as building common consent towards, our governance of our nation. And I think it's a really empowering way to look at that. And I think everybody would agree that what we all want is to have choice over our rights and how they're being implemented, rather than engaging in a rights infringement process. I don't think anybody wants that. I think the other benefit of achieving consent, before I move on to the next slide, is just to remember that when we do that, we have the opportunity to go back to our respective constituencies and say our authorities are being respected. Granting consent presumes that you're there knowing what your authorities are, and you're able to say, this is how I'm implementing them, this choice is good for me and who I work with, who I represent, and everybody can then do that and go back to their constituencies and say that. And that's an implementation effect rather than any kind of fettering or infringement effect. I think it's super empowering. One of the pieces that I wanted to mention is that I think there's much less knowledge in many people's minds about what Indigenous authorities are. I think it's easier to identify or try to identify Western authorities because there are things like written laws and policies and things like that, but I think there's a whole bunch that can be taught and learned regarding what traditional governance practices are. And so Nadia's slide on that issue about some of the traditional governance in her background was really helpful, and I think if we could have more of that, it would be great. Next slide. Okay, so the next slide is the second question is that I just wanted, what came up for me was related to our understanding of what we actually mean by decisions. And I think we need to unpack, if we want to get better at this, we need to unpack all the kinds of decisions that actually are incorporated in that word. Imagine, if you think of each of your jobs, a big flow chart kind of what you would see as the decisions that impact governance. They can range all the way from political level accords and agreements between jurisdictions or authorities, statements made by politicians, as some of them as they become ministers and otherwise, high-level strategic plans, through to mandatory or more structured decisions that would be set out, like, for example, in legislation and regulations. There are so many other also kinds of decisions in the realm of science and data, and they have huge impact on decisions. And so all of these decisions also happen at various scales, right? You can see all of those kinds of things could happen at the local, regional, to watershed level. And so the question that came up for me is, could we do more work in analyzing the way that collaboration works in all of these stages and types of decisions? And if we can do some of this hard work, I think it would be really fruitful. And I think we can see that there's some really effective collaborations that have happened in some realms more than others, potentially in the Indigenous and Western science collaboration level, potentially at the very high level political accord level, maybe in some situations on the ground management stuff. But I think having a little bit more unpacking of what those decisions actually mean would be our next step. And then finally, my last slide is really to remember that the reason why we're doing this is, keeping our eye on the ball as we are working through this process, to remember that at the end of the day, we're trying to have better decisions. And what do those better decisions actually look like in terms of people, particularly people who live in and depend on the watersheds we're talking about, and the water itself, the water and the animals and the plants that rely on it. Do we have the scales of decisions are articulately spelled out so we can actually measure if they're better at the watershed level, at the regional level, down to the local level? If we, I think, at the end of the day, aren't able to demonstrate that the decision making is actually improving the lives of all the species that are dependent on the water, then we're just focusing on process again, and we're missing the forest for the trees. And so I think with that, I will just remind you that Eli and Nadia have turned our attention to the fact that we're in the process of nation building. The NWT just went through a process of devolution April 1st. That's a critical step in the building of Canada as a nation. The Chilcotin decision was an absolute, groundbreaking decision. That's another piece of nation building, and turning our attention to collaborative governance is an evolution of our approach to governance. And I think we've been doing it for the last few centuries, and we can and will continue to evolve. And so I was really appreciative of that particular articulating of collaborative governance. And with that, I think I'll just turn it back to Laura, who I think is going to open the floor for questions now.
Thanks so much, Merrell-Ann. So yes, as Merrell-Ann said, we will turn now to the discussion question period of the webinar. Eli, Merrell-Ann, and Nadia, I'm going to unmute all of you. Don't worry about doing it yourself. We'll get you all okay. Sorry about that delay. So I think Eli, Merrell-Ann, and Nadia, you should all have your voices on the line now. So at this point, folks, if you want to use the chat box, any questions that have come up during the presentation, feel free to direct them to a specific presenter, or it may be something that all three of them can address. While you start to type those questions, at the beginning I promised I would give you a link to the September webinar that we had hosted as part of this ongoing series. And here's actually 3 links. The first is to the webinar recording, which, as I said, talks about 9 winning conditions for watershed governance in British Columbia. So that's the first link. The second link is the report that webinar actually drew on, and Aboriginal CoGovernance is one of those 9 winning conditions that was discussed. And then the third thing I put here, which I suspect will be of interest to some of you, is another webinar that was co-hosted with the Environmental Law Centre here at the University of Victoria, also back in September, on the impact of the Chilcotin Nation versus BC case. And that webinar featured Jay Nelson, I believe is his name, who was the lawyer for Chilcotin Nation during that case. So feel free to download those.
Can you hear me now, Laura?
Yes, I can hear you. There's a feedback loop going on. Either mute your computer speakers or tell me what number, the last 4 digits of the number you called in on.
Gotcha.
Oh, were you able to do it yourself? If not, I can merge your audio and take care of it on my end. I just need to know your phone, the end of your phone number.
2341. Is there still the echo happening?
No, there's no echo, and I don't see your number in the list here, so we'll just
Okay,
go.
Goody. All right.
Okay, we'll just go with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like a few things coming in. I guess the other thing I wanted to mention, I've noticed a few people sharing different resources and links and things during the presentation. So you can scroll up in your chat box and access all of those links as well. So a question from Jessica Brady directed towards Nadia, asking, are there lessons from traditional governance approaches that speak to the need for ongoing engagement, aka consent, as implied by Merrell-Ann's remarks?
Okay, well, thanks for that question, Jessica. I was kind of hoping to escape this discussion without having to answer any questions directly. But just to see if I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but just to try and start to address it, I think the way that I understand it is that there are certainly traditional governance approaches that do speak to the need for ongoing engagement or seeking consent within our membership, and that was simply just something that we practiced. But I think in sort of, say, a broader picture of the relationship between First Nations and governments or the Crown, the consent that's sort of required, I think we have to recognize that there's 2 different nations here that are in a relationship, and so in order for them to move forward in meeting their objectives, there needs to be continued ongoing engagement. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm not sure I understand it correctly.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was from Jessica Brady asking, are there lessons from traditional governance approaches that speak to the need for ongoing engagement, aka consent? Do you have something to add to that, Eli?
Well, I think...
Just to interrupt for a sec, Jessica just added she will work on a rephrasing of the question while others type. So you can go ahead.
The one thing that I would share from our traditional governance practice on the west coast of Vancouver Island is that the highest law in our social contract is the sun-moon crest. And there's nothing complicated about this. We're simply saying that we have to organize ourselves, our economic practices, and our society based on the cycles primarily of the moon and the sun. And so the seasonal cycles were very important in terms of where we would go at different times of the year. And every winter there was a contraction of the community back to winter village sites where there were, it wasn't a static governance process. There was transformation seasonally and in larger epochs, which were marked by the lifetimes of certain people. And so there was always a social fluidity at those times and ongoing checking in, so to speak, and reconfirming of relationships that were demonstrated through the redistribution of wealth and and who was given floor time in the potlatch.
Laura, it's Merrell-Ann. I can try to add a few words on that.
Yeah, please.
So when I talk about consent process, you've got to remember I come at it from a bit of a legal perspective, and I think there are many reasons why co-governance is it's feared by people. I think Eli pointed that out in that beginning survey, that fear is one of the main barriers to this process, I think. But when you look at the legal side of it and we talk about consent, I kind of extend the way the Supreme Court has talked about it, and what I try to think about and how I explain it is it's a process of mutual consent where Indigenous authorities and governments have to be comfortable that they're achieving the consent for the things that they care about, and non-Indigenous governments have to achieve that also. And because all governments have value in this country, and so I think that the only way you can do that is through extended, ongoing relationships that involve talking and talking and talking and meeting and talking. And I think traditional Indigenous perspectives, traditional Indigenous governance practices, which are also in many places in the country practiced today, have excellent examples and ways of doing this just through all forms of discussion. So you can see going, the Wildlife Act in the Northwest Territories is a great example. It took, I don't know, close to 15 years or something of going around and round and round. They met, typical sharing circle kind of style around a table, around over and over and over and over again until they got it right, and it was not going ahead until it was right. I know that this can take extra time, but I think quality matters more than time sometimes, and particularly when you're talking about these kinds of decisions. And so, looking at the traditional way decisions can be made, where you keep going around in a circle until you reach it, until understanding has been reached by all players, is kind of the way that it needs to go. And so I'm not sure if that answers your question also.
Okay, thanks all of you. A question from June Ross saying, many of our watersheds on Vancouver Island are privately held because of the ENN land grant. This grant was given to Dunsmuir with no consideration given to First Nations. Are any First Nations on the island taking this issue on? I don't know if any of you can speak to that at all.
I'm not aware of anything myself, but it sounds like an important issue to follow up on.
Great. Thanks, Eli. Next is more of a comment, I guess, from Pamela Zevitt saying cumulative effects and lack of understanding of past landscape conditions are a continued major gap in most processes. Land use decision makers keep saying they will recognize these gaps and work to integrate them to ensure more robust decision making, but we still seem stuck in business as usual ways of doing things. Do any of the three of you have any thoughts or comments on that?
This is Nadia. Well, maybe I'll just respond really quickly to this, since a lot of the work that I did in the Yukon was with my community and advancing their vision of watershed management. And I found one of the biggest challenges in doing this kind of work was actually working with my own community to try and integrate Aboriginal traditional knowledge into these more sort of formalized Western scientific approaches to management. And you're absolutely right. There's certainly a paucity of data, especially in these more remote areas, where, at least in my experience, I was finding that my work and my baseline data was much more enhanced by the information that was coming in by the people who were actually on the land consistently, and what they were noticing in terms of noticeable trends happening on the land, to wildlife populations, to weather patterns, climate patterns. These sorts of things over long term were in fact echoed exactly in the few bits of data that I could find that had been measured over the last, say, 20 or 30 years. But the challenge that I found was that there aren't a lot of really great tools yet that kind of effectively integrate these two systems. And so what I found with a lot of researchers as well who were interested in doing this kind of work is that because of their lack of tools, and perhaps even, while we say it's great and fantastic to work with Indigenous communities to try and integrate Aboriginal traditional knowledge into our management systems and processes, that there really is a lack of respect, I think, for the amount of information that First Nations individuals can accumulate over decades because of their relationships to their lands and their waters and their resources. And so there's kind of these two barriers, I think, to being able to address this, exactly what Pamela is bringing up.
Thank you, Nadia. Just wanting to touch back on June Ross's question about the ENN. Burnett Lalibert from Cowichan Watershed, or Cowichan Tribe, sorry, says that the Hulkaminum Treaty Group itself is in the process of taking this one. So there's an answer to that for you, June. A question from Reg Whiten for Merrell-Ann specifically. Wondering how case law is evolving on recognition of water rights, for example, in Treaty 7, seems like the critical path forward.
Okay, so I think that, yeah, the case law is evolving. It's just not evolving very quickly. And I was a bit disappointed to see that, for example, in the Chilcotin decision, that the Supreme Court didn't deal with water. As I understand it, the Chilcotin people didn't put water forward at the higher court level to get that clarified. They had reached an arrangement that it wasn't critical to the determination of their case that the specifics of water be addressed in that case. However, I think the view that they take, and is a logical and reasonable view, is that it's included in grants of title to land, because water and land are inseparable, and I think that's certainly the argument that they will put forward. It may very well be challenged, but as I understand it, it'll evolve over time. I think that, and I've talked about this quite a bit over time, that it's up to governments, all governments, to recognize that I think the treaties needed to take into account the long-term sustainability of the nations on both sides. And so it makes sense that Indigenous peoples would have governance rights regarding water the same that they would have any other governance rights under the treaty, or outside of the treaty. Issues that were not specifically dealt with in the treaty would still persist. The problem with the discussion around linking it to case law is that I think you get really trapped in, until it's proven, nothing can be done, because both sides go, no, you don't have that right, and yes, I do, or no, whatever. And I think that collaborative co-governance would be, it's an opportunity to step outside that debate and say, without putting a really fine point on who has what exactly, let's collaborate to make the best decision so that we're achieving the long-term sustainability that was envisioned by the treaties. I think this happens all the time in Canadian governance. I don't think it's a new idea to think of showing up at the table without having absolute pristine clarity about jurisdiction. It happens all the time in the water field. That's how the feds and the province don't know exactly who has jurisdiction over every part of water. It's split into different sections and different levels, and they sometimes shift things over to the other jurisdiction, and it's all done by agreement. And so I've always argued, so we just bring another set of governments to the table to properly manage water and watersheds. And so I prefer to place the discussion about water and water rights in the context of a co-governance discussion for that reason.
The next question comes from Deborah Jarvie, saying, the word knowledge came up a few times during the presentations. This word has many levels of meaning and affects the mental models of the consensus process. Does anyone know of any studies or practices that clearly address the idea of knowledge into governance models?
Can you hear me, Laura?
Yep.
Thank you. I'm not sure I understand the question perfectly, but in the Nuu-chah-nulth social contract, I've referred to it as a active participation in a social contract, and this is because the rules and regulations of society are encoded in art, which can essentially be thought of as memory devices. And these memory devices, crests in the art form, were associated and are associated with different stories. And in the stories are encoded moral ethics, environmental ethics, history, tellings of history. And so it's a type of symbolic communication, and because the art is looking at us from every part of the built environment, it's a living interaction with the social contract. And so for Nuu-chah-nulth people, this is a really important thing. We found ourselves creating all of these land use plans and watershed plans and, GPS this and that, and we found ourselves starting to feel more like an arm of the provincial Integrated Land Management Bureau than our own traditional governance system. And so we had to remind ourselves and talk with our elders and revisit the importance of the transmission of knowledge, and how in Nuu-chah-nulth culture, knowledge isn't just something that you learn, it's something that you ingest. And we have knowledge from our salmon, that when we ingest our salmon, we learn, and we have a co-evolutionary process. And so we have to be careful not to become too bureaucratic, and remember that it is our ancestral ways of governance that were successful, that were able to create the right types of outcomes. The technocization, or the technocratic approach has created negative results. And so we have to find a balance.
Thanks, Eli. I just want to draw people's attention to the time. It's 20 after 10. We're scheduled until 10:30, and I think with the number of questions that are in the queue here, that'll probably take us there. We may not be able to get to everybody's question. I do want to, though, say that this is going to be an ongoing dialogue, and due to the popularity of this session, we're actually considering maybe having some sort of follow-up session, even maybe just with those people who are in the room today, to continue this. That's something we can talk about if that seems like it might be of interest, particularly to those of you in the room who are really looking to move forward or implement or do some of this stuff. So anyways, we'll keep moving on with the discussion, but just to let you know, I apologize. We probably won't be able to get to everybody. Coming back to this knowledge question that Eli was just discussing, I'm going to jump down to a comment from Carrie Terbasket. She says she feels the concept of knowledge is an important one that should have substantial time and effort put into unpacking and looking at from all sides. The entire premise of how decisions are made in the non-Indigenous realm, provincial, federal, municipal governments, is based on a knowledge system that is completely incompatible and based on a worldview that doesn't allow or acknowledge most of the concepts found within Indigenous societies. For example, reverence, reciprocity. So how can Indigenous people join such a structure and have their knowledge, quote unquote, incorporated? She says she doesn't believe in integration, but creating a parallel process that does not lose or compromise our knowledge systems. Co-creation of the process is important as well. This would require actual reconciliation principles, acknowledgement time, etc. So just wanted to read that out in case anybody has lost it in the chat box. And Merrell-Ann, Eli, Nadia, do you have anything to add to Carrie's comment at all?
Yes, Merrell-Ann, I'll jump in. I think that when you think of how decision-making processes right now, if they're dominated by a non-Indigenous government that is usually governed by 4-year political timeframes, and the different perspectives that come in as each of those, election cycles change, you can see that it's very different. It's a very short time frame. It's very difficult to, within that, to truly understand the scope of knowledge that exists in a particular region or regarding a particular issue from all perspectives. And so I think in those short time frames, you do find things like people trying to integrate knowledge when it really shouldn't be about that, or trying to find the immediate answer to some knowledge that a knowledge base can give us so that we can make a decision right now. And so I also wonder about whether co-governance is one of the solutions to the fact of the persistence of knowledge over time, its ability to guide us over long periods of time. I think if co-governance allows that, because the processes would continue as governments change, it would, by definition, I think you would have to, because governance continues. But if it's co-governance, you're talking longer time frames that allow knowledge to build and persist over time. And I think you can start to, if you have that, you can start to address some of those thorny questions that Pamela brought up about cumulative effects also. Short-term knowledge bases are routinely the only thing we have, because programs get cut and things get, all that stuff that affects evidence and information. And you can start to have the knowledge bases persist longer to be able to influence some of those thorny questions around cumulative effects and stuff like that. So that's my thought on that last comment.
Thanks. One other thing on this knowledge conversation, Rod DeBell, who's down the hall from me here at the Center for Global Studies, says that there's a report that addresses the question of knowledge in governance. It's volume 4 of Report of Scientific Panel on Sustainable Forestry in Clayoquot Sound. I don't have a link to that at the moment, but we can find that. A couple others of you have been asking about all the resources and things in the chat box. We can certainly go through after we finish today, our team here at the Water Project, and mine some of these links and resources and put together a handout or something from this webinar. So that will be available. And also, assuming all the speakers agree, we can plan maybe to have their presentations as a PDF. I'll just confirm with them. So I think that addresses all of that at the moment. Let's move on to a question from Rick Simpson, which is a question for all 3 speakers and the group at large. How do you see the evolution of water co-governance on the ground and in the water over the next generation? What could we reasonably expect to see happening?
If I can jump in, it's Merrell-Ann. I think you're going to continue to see 2 dominant forces. One is the lead being taken by Indigenous nations throughout the world and in Canada on promoting and implementing themselves, whether everyone else agrees with it or not, models that they think are effective and based on their Indigenous governance authorities and in line with their practices and viewpoints. And I think that there will be quite a bit of that, and you've heard the 2 previous presenters give some examples. I think similarly, governments like the government of the Northwest Territories, of which half are Indigenous people, even at the territorial level, you'll continue to see innovations happen there on how governments can all work together. So that's the one where even if you have some of the stalwarts of the old approach continue to hold on to, with their fingers gripping the last few pieces of the old style of governance, I think you'll continue to see pushing happening from the ground. The other piece, I think, is that we're going to continue to get really strong pronouncements out of the Supreme Court saying people you need a different approach. Like Indigenous rights that are protected by the Constitution will always continue to be that way. They're strong. Indigenous people will see them continue to thrive, and we all as Canadians need to try to get there and be part of a governance process that ensures that. And so I think, the Supreme Court direction has not been turning away from Indigenous protections at all. It's been going consistently one way or another in the favor of supporting Indigenous rights and their expression and implementation. So we'll continue to see that. And I think our opportunity is to jump way ahead of that curve and just do something now.
So sort of nice follow-up to that one, a question from Jose Messot, asking, can the panel give any advice on the first steps a non-Indigenous organization should take to engage Indigenous groups in a meaningful way? And Nadia, I think you sort of started to prod on this a little bit in your presentation at the beginning.
Oh, sure. I can take this one. Well, there's an excellent resource out there if you're not familiar with it, called How to, or Working Effectively with Aboriginal Peoples, I think is what it's called, and it's by Bob Joseph. And it's an amazing resource. It really takes you sort of step by step as to whether or not you're an industry, you're a stakeholder, you're a government, or you're just simply interested in working with First Nations peoples. It kind of lays out the framework for understanding kind of the context of why communities may or may not be set up the way that they are, and then how to proceed within that context. But I think another important thing that we always need to keep in mind is that there's a huge diversity of Indigenous communities across Canada. And so if you're really looking to engage with a community meaningfully, I mean, I guess I would want to understand what's the intention. Are you looking at it from, say, an industry or stakeholders perspective, and you're looking to build in some sort of process, then that process would be different. But then if you're just looking to get to know who your First Nations neighbors are, then that's another process altogether. And I would say the best way to do that is really find out as much as you can about your First Nations neighbor. Understand where their celebrations are, if they're open to visitors, if there's any sorts of resource materials available from the First Nations bands or the Aboriginal communities where you're at, and approach it that way, because there's no one answer and there's no one way. So that's great that you're looking to do that, and good luck with it.
I'd like to add a couple things there, Laura.
Yeah, please.
Okay, for the last question, share a meal. Eat a meal together. And I think the most, the watershed governance workshop that we had in Duncan in January, we were talking about what benefit Indigenous knowledge can bring to watershed governance. I think the knowledge of different plants and the ecosystems are really great, and I think that's highly valuable, but it's about process. The biggest strength that Indigenous knowledge can bring is to the process and the way that we interact. And I find that when we stop introducing ourselves with business cards and start talking about where we're from and who we're connected to and the places we're connected to, then we start seeing each other as human beings instead of First Nations and government and university this or industry, to see that we're all human beings, I think, is the first step, and sharing a meal is a great way to do that. I wanted to just say a quick thing on where we're going and what to expect. Tribal parks from every province in Canada, or whatever you end up calling it. It could be tribal grounds, or every nation is going to have one. And the ICCA Consortium was, as I had mentioned, was based on the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. We're in an extinction event, and the coexistence of biological diversity and cultural diversity is not an accident. So that's all I'll say. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks so much, Eli. And we are at time. I know that there's a number of questions that we were not able to get to. I've been copying and pasting them out of the chat box, and we're going to put some thought into what might make sense as the best way to continue this conversation, assuming that's of interest to everybody in the room. I did just want to bring up a quick final poll here. For those of you who are still with us, just asking what topics or issues would you want to further explore within the context of co-governance if we were to continue this session. If you have a time to just quickly fill that out, I know some of you probably have to leave, and that's fine as well. And also just a really quick poll, if you're interested in doing a follow-up session, yes or no. And we can follow up with those of you in the room here. So as you guys continue to answer those, I just want to say thank you to everybody for making the time to be here today. I think it was a really valuable discussion, and we'll certainly be in touch at the very least when the video is posted, and we'll mine the chat box for the resources as we discussed. And we'll see, maybe Eli, Merrell-Ann, and Nadia, we can chat if you'd be interested in being involved in a follow-up session, and also we'd like to maybe get some other voices as well. So any of you out there, if you have some thoughts or think you could offer some perspective, feel free to get in touch, and we'll see how that shapes up. So thank you. Have a wonderful day. I'll leave this open for a while if you want to sort of keep adding some answers there. And other than that, you'll hear from me soon. Take care.
Have a good day, everyone.